The cry came from beneath the dead. Emily Rains stood in the skeletal remains of what had once been a stable, her boots grinding against rotted wood and rusted nails, when she heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in this graveyard of dreams. The dollar bill in her pocket felt heavier than the deed to this collapsing monument to failure. She had bought death for $1, but something alive was calling from the grave. The female ranger bought a collapsing stable for $1, then heard a wild foal crying under the floor. Her heart stopped as the cry came again, weaker now, like hope bleeding out through broken boards. Subscribe now, because some rescues change everything, and this one will break your heart before it heals it. Emily Rains had seen death before, but never bought it for $1. The foreclosure notice fluttered against the stable's broken door like a white flag of surrender, and the Montana wind carried the scent of decay and abandoned dreams across the desolate farmland. She pulled the crumpled bill from her jacket pocket, staring at George Washington's weathered face as if he might offer some wisdom about purchasing ruins. The wildlife rehabilitation project needed land, needed space for the broken animals that came to her like pilgrims seeking sanctuary. But this place felt more like a cemetery than a sanctuary. The stable's roof had caved in 3 winters ago, according to the county clerk, and what remained stood like the ribcage of some massive beast, picked clean by time and neglect. The real estate agent had laughed when she made the offer. $1 for 12 acres of worthless land and a structure that should have been bulldozed years ago. But Emily saw something else in the skeletal remains of the building, something that whispered of second chances and resurrection. Her boots crunched through broken glass and scattered hay as she stepped inside, and the silence felt heavy, pregnant with secrets. The floorboards sagged beneath her weight, some missing entirely, revealing the dark crawl space below, where shadows pooled like stagnant water. She had rescued eagles with broken wings, wolves caught in illegal traps, bears orphaned by poachers. But this place needed rescuing too, needed someone to believe it could live again. The afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the walls, casting prison bar shadows across the debris-strewn floor, and Emily felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This was what she did. She took the broken things, the forgotten things, the things everyone else had given up on, and she fought to make them whole again. Her father had been the same way, a veterinarian who never met a lost cause he wouldn't take on, who taught her that sometimes the most important work happened in the dark places where hope had died. The stable creaked around her like an old ship in a storm, and she wondered if she was crazy for seeing potential in this wreckage, for believing that something beautiful could rise from these ruins. She knelt beside a pile of rotted lumber, running her fingers along the grain of wood that had once been strong enough to shelter horses, to protect them from the harsh Montana winters and the predators that prowled the darkness. The previous owner had been a horse breeder, according to the records, a man named Thomas Garrett, who had lost everything when the drought came and the banks called in their debts. His horses had been sold at auction, scattered to the winds, like seeds from a dying plant, and the stable had been left to rot like a monument to failure. Emily could almost hear the echoes of their hoofbeats, the gentle nickering of mares calling to their foals, the sound of life that had once filled this place with purpose and joy. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and sending a chill down Emily's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her knees, and surveyed the wreckage with the eye of someone who had spent her life putting broken things back together. The foundation was solid, the bones of the structure still strong beneath the decay, and she could envision the work it would take. New roof, new walls, new floors, new life breathed into dead wood and rusted metal. It would cost more than she had, would require months of backbreaking labor, would test every skill her father had taught her about construction and healing and faith. But as she turned to leave, as she prepared to walk away from this dollar grave and find somewhere else to build her sanctuary, she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it, so impossible she thought she might be imagining it. A cry, weak and desperate, coming from beneath the broken floor. Emily froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, and listened with every fibre of her being. The sound came again, muffled by wood and debris, but unmistakably real, unmistakably alive. Something was trapped down there in the darkness, something that needed her, something that had been waiting for someone to hear its desperate plea for salvation. The cry from below will haunt you. Subscribe to witness a rescue that defies every law of survival. Emily dropped to her knees so hard the impact sent shockwaves through the rotted floorboards, and the cry came again, weaker now, like a prayer whispered by dying lips. Her hands shook as she pressed her ear to the wood, listening for the impossible sound that had stopped her heart and changed everything in the space of a single breath. The darkness below seemed to pulse with hidden life, and she could smell something else now beneath the decay, the warm, sweet scent of hay and horse, as if time had folded back on itself and the stable's living past was bleeding through the cracks. She grabbed a loose board and pried it up with her bare hands, splinters driving deep into her palms as she tore at the barrier between herself and whatever was crying in the tomb below. The board came free with a groan of protest, revealing a slice of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light like a hungry mouth. Emily fumbled for her phone's flashlight, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline and desperation, and when the beam cut through the shadows, she saw them, two shapes huddled together in the crawl space like refugees from a war that had ended years ago. A mare, her coat matted with dirt and dried blood, lay on her side with her ribs showing through her skin like the bars of a prison, and pressed against her belly, so small it seemed impossible that such a tiny creature could produce such a powerful cry, was a foal, newborn, still wet with birth, its dark eyes reflecting the light like twin stars in the darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing, a birth that had happened in secret, in darkness, in a place where no one was supposed to be alive. The mare's eyes found hers through the gap in the floor, and Emily saw intelligence there, and pain, and a desperate plea that needed no words. The mother was dying, had been dying for hours or maybe days, but she had held on long enough to bring her baby into the world, had used the last of her strength to give life even as her own was slipping away. The foal struggled against its mother's side, its legs too weak to support its weight, its cries growing fainter with each passing moment. Emily tore at the floorboards with savage intensity, her ranger training taking over as she calculated angles and leverage points, her mind racing through the logistics of rescue even as her heart broke for the suffering she was witnessing. The mare was too large to lift through the gap, too weak to stand, but the foal might still have a chance if she could get to it quickly enough. She ripped board after board from the floor, creating a hole large enough for her to drop through, and when she lowered herself into the crawl space, the smell of birth and death and desperate hope hit her like a physical blow. The space was barely 3 feet high, forcing her to crawl on her belly through the dirt and debris, and as she drew closer to the horses, she could see the full extent of their situation. The mare had somehow found her way under the stable, probably seeking shelter when her labor began, and had given birth in this dark sanctuary beneath the ruins. But the effort had cost her everything. Emily could see the blood, could hear the labored breathing that spoke of internal injuries and systems shutting down. The foal, though, the foal was perfect, unmarked by its mother's suffering, a miracle of life born in the shadow of death. Emily reached out slowly, her voice soft and steady, despite the chaos in her heart, speaking the same gentle words she used with all the broken animals that came to her seeking healing. The mare's eyes tracked her movement, and Emily saw recognition there, saw the ancient understanding that passes between mothers of all species when they know their time is ending and must trust their children to the kindness of strangers. The foal's cries had weakened to barely audible whimpers, and Emily knew she had minutes, maybe less, before the tiny creature joined its mother in whatever realm awaited beyond the darkness. She gathered the foal in her arms, feeling its heartbeat against her chest like a hummingbird's wings, and as she lifted it toward the light above, the mare made a sound, not quite a whinny, not quite a sigh, but something that sounded like gratitude, like blessing, like a mother's final gift to her child. Emily's tears fell onto the foal's dark coat as she climbed back through the hole in the floor, carrying this impossible life into the world above, knowing that she held in her hands not just a baby horse, but a responsibility that would change everything she thought she knew about rescue and redemption and the price of bringing the dead back to life. What Emily discovers next about this stable's hidden past will shatter everything she believes about coincidence. Subscribe before the truth emerges. The foal weighed nothing and everything as Emily cradled it against her chest, its tiny heart beating so fast she could feel it through her jacket, like a desperate Morse code message tapped out by trembling fingers. She had carried dying animals before, had felt the terrible lightness of creatures whose spirits were already halfway to whatever waited beyond the veil. But this was different. This was life clinging to existence by threads so fine they might snap if she breathed too hard. The afternoon sun felt harsh after the darkness below, and the foal's eyes squeezed shut against the brightness as Emily stumbled toward her truck, her mind racing through everything she knew about newborn horses and emergency veterinary care, and the thin line between salvation and loss. Her truck became a mobile intensive care unit as she spread blankets in the back and created a nest for the tiny creature that had somehow survived birth in a tomb. The foal's breathing was shallow but steady, its legs folding beneath it like a broken marionette, and Emily could see the delicate tracery of veins beneath its dark coat, the fragile architecture of a life that had entered the world under impossible circumstances. She had formula in her emergency kit, the kind used for orphaned wildlife, but she had never tried to save something this young, this vulnerable, this completely dependent on her knowledge and her will to fight death for every breath. As she drove toward her ranch, the foal's head resting in her lap, Emily found herself thinking about the mare, still trapped beneath the stable floor, still breathing but fading like a candle in a windstorm. She would have to go back, would have to try to save the mother too, even though every instinct told her it was already too late. The mare's eyes haunted her, the intelligence there, the acceptance, the way she had looked at Emily as if she had been waiting for her, as if somehow she had known that help would come in the form of a woman who bought broken places for $1 and believed in resurrection. The foal stirred in her lap as they pulled into her driveway, its tiny mouth opening in a silent cry that spoke of hunger and confusion and the primal need for warmth that all newborns carry like a birthright. Emily's ranch was modest. A small house, a barn converted into a wildlife rehabilitation center, pens and enclosures for the various broken creatures that found their way to her door like pilgrims seeking sanctuary. She had built this place with her own hands after her father died, had poured his insurance money and her life savings into creating a refuge for the animals that no one else wanted to save, the ones too damaged or too wild or too expensive to matter to anyone else. Inside the barn, Emily set up a makeshift nursery in one of the smaller stalls, lining it with fresh straw and heat lamps, creating a warm cocoon where the foal could fight for its life in comfort and safety. She mixed formula with the precision of a pharmacist, testing the temperature on her wrist the way her father had taught her, remembering his gentle hands guiding hers as he showed her how to feed orphaned fawns and abandoned bear cubs. The foal took the bottle eagerly once she got the nipple positioned correctly, its tiny tongue working with desperate efficiency, and Emily felt the first flutter of hope in her chest, like a bird testing its wings. But even as she watched the foal drink, Even as she saw strength returning to its tiny frame, with each swallow, her mind kept returning to the stable and the mare lying beneath the broken floor. She had left her truck's headlights on, had marked the location with orange surveyor's tape, but she knew that time was running out for the mother who had given everything to bring this miracle into the world. The foal finished the bottle and curled up in the straw, its breathing deeper now, more regular, and Emily made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. She would go back, would try to save them both, would refuse to let death claim the mother after life had already claimed the child. The drive back to the stable felt like a journey through purgatory, the setting sun painting the Montana sky, the color of blood and fire. And when Emily pulled up to the ruins, she could see her headlight beams cutting through the gathering darkness like searchlights looking for survivors in a war zone. She had brought everything she could think of, ropes and pulleys, a portable winch, veterinary supplies, enough equipment to attempt a rescue that bordered on the impossible. The stable looked different in the darkness, more like a cathedral than a ruin. And as Emily approached the hole in the floor, she could hear the mare's breathing, fainter now, more labored, but still there, still fighting. The mare's secret will rewrite everything Emily thought she knew about this place. Subscribe to uncover the truth that's been buried for decades. Emily descended into the crawl space like a spelunker entering a sacred cave, her headlamp cutting through the darkness to reveal the mare's condition in stark, unforgiving detail. The horse lay exactly where Emily had left her, but something had changed. Her breathing was more peaceful now, as if the successful rescue of her foal had lifted some terrible weight from her spirit. Emily could see the intelligence in the mare's dark eyes, the way she tracked every movement, and there was something else there too, a kind of recognition, as if she had been waiting not just for rescue, but for Emily specifically, as if their meeting had been written in some cosmic script that neither of them could read, but both somehow understood. The mare's injuries were extensive but not necessarily fatal. Dehydration, exhaustion, some internal bleeding from the difficult birth, but nothing that couldn't be treated with time and proper care. Emily worked with the methodical precision her father had drilled into her, starting an IV line to combat the dehydration, administering pain medication and antibiotics, her hands steady despite the impossible circumstances. The mare accepted the treatment with the patience of a creature who had endured worse, and as Emily worked, she found herself talking to the horse in the same gentle voice she used with all her patients, explaining what she was doing, promising that everything would be all right, that the foal was safe and strong and waiting for her. But it was while she was examining the mare more closely that Emily made the discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about this place. Hidden beneath the horse's matted coat, barely visible in the dim light, was a small brand, not the crude mark of ownership that most ranchers used, but something more elegant, more purposeful. Emily cleaned the area carefully and shone her light directly on the mark, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It was a symbol she recognized from her father's old veterinary journals, a mark used by a secret network of veterinarians and horse breeders who had worked to save endangered bloodlines during the worst years of the agricultural collapse. The brand was the mark of the Underground Railroad for horses, a network her father had told her about in whispered conversations, a group of people who had risked everything to preserve genetic lines that would have been lost forever when the big corporate farms took over and the small breeders went bankrupt. Emily's hands shook as she traced the symbol with her finger, realizing that this mare wasn't just any horse. She was a living piece of history, a survivor of a secret war fought to preserve something precious and irreplaceable. The foal upstairs wasn't just a baby horse, it was the continuation of a bloodline that someone had died to protect. Emily's mind raced as she pieced together the implications of her discovery. Thomas Garrett, the previous owner of the stable, hadn't just been a horse breeder. He had been part of the underground network. had used this place as a sanctuary for horses that were supposed to be extinct, bloodlines that existed only in the memories of old horsemen and the secret records of veterinarians who refused to let them die. The mare had somehow survived here, hidden beneath the ruins, carrying the genetic legacy of horses that had run wild across the American West before civilization tamed them into submission. The foal represented not just new life, but the resurrection of something that had been thought lost forever. As Emily continued her examination, she found more evidence of the stable's secret purpose: hidden compartments in the walls, concealed feed storage areas, a sophisticated ventilation system that had allowed horses to be kept here without detection. This place had been designed as a sanctuary, a fortress where the last representatives of dying breeds could be protected from a world that valued profit over preservation, efficiency over beauty. The mare's presence here wasn't an accident. She had been brought here deliberately, had been part of a breeding program that continued even after the official operation had been shut down, even after Thomas Garrett had lost everything and disappeared into the night. The weight of responsibility settled on Emily's shoulders like a mantle passed down from generation to generation, and she understood now why she had been drawn to this place. Why she had felt compelled to buy it for $1, despite its apparent worthlessness. This wasn't just about rescuing 2 horses. This was about continuing a mission that had been interrupted but never abandoned, about taking up a torch that had been dropped but never extinguished. The mare looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries, and Emily made a promise that felt like a sacred vow. She would not let this bloodline die, would not let the sacrifice of those who had come before be in vain. As she prepared to attempt the mare's rescue, rigging pulleys and ropes with the skill of someone who had spent her life moving large animals in impossible circumstances, Emily felt the presence of her father beside her, felt the approval of Thomas Garrett and all the others who had fought this secret war for preservation and hope. The mare would live. The foal would grow strong, and the stable would rise again, not as a monument to failure, but as a testament to the power of those who refuse to let beautiful things die, who believe that some treasures are worth any sacrifice to preserve. The bloodline Emily has discovered will attract dangerous attention. Subscribe to see how far some people will go to claim what was never meant to be found. The veterinary records Emily found in the hidden compartment told a story that made her hands shake as she read by lamplight. Dr. Marcus Thorne hadn't just been saving horses, he'd been preserving bloodlines that powerful syndicates and government agencies had marked for extinction. Each page revealed another piece of a puzzle that stretched back decades, connecting wild Mustang herds to Arabian royalty, linking forgotten Native American horse traditions to modern genetic warfare. The foal sleeping in the stall beside her wasn't just any wild horse. Ash carried genes that certain people would kill to possess and others would die to protect. Emily traced her finger along the bloodline charts, seeing how Thorne had risked everything to keep these genetic treasures from falling into the wrong hands. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy with the knowledge that she now held the future of something irreplaceable. Luna's recovery had been miraculous, but Emily noticed the mare's constant vigilance, the way her ears swiveled at every sound, the protective stance she took whenever strangers approached. The horse knew something Emily was only beginning to understand. That safety was an illusion, that the peaceful Montana Valley could become a battlefield overnight. Emily spent hours studying the mare's scars, reading the story of violence and survival written across her hide in raised welts and healed wounds. Some were from barbed wire and rough terrain, but others spoke of human cruelty, of ropes and whips, and the desperate flight from those who would cage what was meant to run free. Luna's eyes held memories that Emily could only imagine. Scenes of midnight raids and thundering hooves, of mares separated from foals and stallions driven into box canyons with no escape. The trust Luna showed her felt sacred, a covenant between two females who understood that protection sometimes required sacrifice. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Emily found fresh tire tracks circling the property, deep grooves in the mud that spoke of heavy vehicles and deliberate surveillance. She followed the tracks to the ridge overlooking the stable, where someone had set up a temporary observation post, complete with cigarette butts and energy drink cans scattered in the grass. Her ranger training kicked in as she photographed the evidence, noting the expensive boot prints and the professional way the site had been abandoned. Nothing left behind by accident, everything calculated to send a message. Emily felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before dangerous encounters, the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive during her years tracking poachers and drug runners in the wilderness. She knew she was being watched, studied, evaluated by people who saw Ash and Luna not as living beings, but as commodities to be acquired. The game had begun, and Emily realized she was playing against opponents who wrote the rules as they went. That evening, Emily called her former supervisor at the Fish and Wildlife Service, a gruff man named Bill Hendricks, who'd taught her that sometimes the law was a luxury you couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. His voice carried the weight of 30 years fighting the same battles, protecting the same treasures from the same predators who wore different faces but shared the same hunger. Bill listened without interruption as Emily described her discovery, the bloodline records, the surveillance, the growing certainty that she'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple rescue operation. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough for Emily to wonder if the connection had been lost, until Bill's gravelly voice cut through the static with words that chilled her blood. "Emily, girl, you found yourself holding the keys to a kingdom that some very dangerous people consider their rightful inheritance," he said, his tone carrying the weight of classified knowledge and buried secrets. "Doctor, Thorn was under federal protection when he disappeared, and the people who made him disappear are still out there, still hunting." The revelation that Thorn had been working with federal agencies changed everything Emily thought she knew about the situation. According to Bill, the veterinarian had been part of a covert program designed to preserve genetic diversity in American horse populations, a project that had attracted the attention of foreign governments and private collectors willing to pay millions for the right bloodlines. Thorne's work had threatened billion-dollar breeding operations and challenged the monopolies that controlled the international horse trade, making him a target for elimination rather than negotiation. Emily learned that the stable she'd bought for $1 had been the center of a genetic preservation network that stretched across 3 states, with safe houses and breeding facilities hidden in remote locations where endangered bloodlines could be protected from those who would exploit them. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her as she realized that Ash wasn't just a rescued foal. He was a living repository of genetic information that could revolutionize horse breeding, or, in the wrong hands, be used to create biological weapons targeting specific populations. As night fell over the Montana Valley, Emily stood in the stable doorway watching Ash nurse from his mother, the simple act of survival taking on new meaning in light of everything she'd learned. The foal's legs had grown stronger each day, his coat developing the distinctive markings that marked him as something special, something worth fighting for. Emily thought about Dr. Thorne, wondering what his last moments had been like, whether he'd known that his life's work would survive in the form of this small, vulnerable creature who trusted her completely. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but Emily had faced overwhelming odds before, had stood alone against forces that seemed insurmountable, and found ways to prevail through determination and faith. She touched the cross hanging around her neck, a gift from her grandmother who taught her that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, that protecting the innocent was a calling that transcended personal safety or comfort. The federal agents who protected Dr. Thorne failed to save him, but Emily won't make the same mistakes. Subscribe to witness a ranger's war against forces that operate above the law. The black SUVs arrived at dawn. Three vehicles moving in perfect formation down the dirt road like predators stalking wounded prey. Emily watched from the stable's upper window as men in expensive suits emerged, their movements coordinated and purposeful, their eyes scanning the property with the cold efficiency of professional hunters. She recognized the type from her years in federal service, government contractors who operated in the grey areas between legal and necessary, men who solved problems that couldn't be addressed through official channels. Their leader was a tall man with silver hair and dead eyes, someone who'd learned to kill without conscience and sleep without dreams, whose presence made the very air feel dangerous. Emily counted 6 men total, each carrying themselves with the confidence of those who'd never faced consequences for their actions, who believed that money and connections placed them above the laws that governed ordinary people. The stable suddenly felt like a fortress under siege, with Emily and her charges trapped inside, while wolves circled outside. Luna sensed the danger immediately, her nostrils flaring as she positioned herself between Ash and the stable entrance. Every muscle in her body coiled for flight or fight. The mare's ears lay flat against her skull, and Emily could see the whites of her eyes as ancient instincts screamed warnings that transcended species barriers. Ash pressed close to his mother's side, his young mind unable to understand the threat, but responding to Luna's fear with trembling legs and rapid breathing. Emily felt her own heart racing as she checked her rifle, knowing that 6 rounds wouldn't be enough against 6 trained killers, but finding comfort in the familiar weight of steel and wood. She thought about her father, a Vietnam veteran who taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, that sometimes the only choice was between dying on your feet or living on your knees. The stable had become a battlefield, and Emily was the only thing standing between her charges and those who would cage them or kill them. The silver-haired man approached the stable alone, his hands visible but his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation rather than force. Emily met him at the entrance, her rifle held casually but ready, her ranger badge visible on her chest like a shield that had lost its power to protect. His voice was cultured, educated, the kind of smooth delivery that came from years of convincing people to surrender what they couldn't afford to lose. He introduced himself as Director Harrison from a government agency whose acronym meant nothing to Emily, speaking in the careful language of bureaucrats who specialized in making threats sound like offers of assistance. Harrison explained that Ash and Luna were assets of national security interest that needed to be relocated to appropriate facilities for their own protection, his words carrying the implicit threat that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Emily listened without speaking, recognizing the script of those who believed that official titles gave them the right to steal whatever they desired. The negotiation that followed was a dance of words and implications, each side probing for weakness while maintaining the pretense of civilized discourse. Harrison offered Emily money more than she'd ever seen, enough to buy her own ranch and live comfortably for the rest of her life, but his eyes never left the stable where Ash and Luna waited in growing terror. Emily countered with questions about Dr. Thorne's disappearance, watching Harrison's face for tells that might reveal the truth about the veterinarian's fate, but the man's expression remained as cold and unreadable as carved stone. The conversation revealed the scope of the forces arrayed against her. Government agencies, private military contractors, international syndicates that treated genetic material like currency and living beings like inventory to be catalogued and stored. Emily realized that Harrison wasn't just after Ash and Luna. He was eliminating the last witnesses to a program that had operated outside congressional oversight, cleaning up loose ends that could embarrass powerful people if they ever came to light. As the standoff continued, Emily found herself thinking about the choices that had led her to this moment. The series of decisions that had transformed a simple rescue operation into a fight for survival against forces she'd once served. Her years as a ranger had taught her to read the landscape, to understand how predators moved and where prey might find sanctuary. But this was different, a hunt where the rules changed constantly, and the hunters wore badges that should have made them protectors. Harrison's patience was wearing thin, his polite facade cracking to reveal the violence that lurked beneath, the willingness to use whatever force necessary to achieve his objectives. Emily could see the other men positioning themselves around the stable, cutting off escape routes and establishing fields of fire, their movements betraying military training and combat experience. The peaceful Montana Valley had become a war zone, and Emily was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. The moment of truth came when Harrison's radio crackled with an update from his surveillance team, confirmation that Emily was alone and vulnerable, that no backup was coming to even the odds. His smile was the expression of a shark that had cornered its prey, cold and predatory and utterly without mercy, as he delivered his final ultimatum with the casual tone of someone ordering coffee. Emily had 30 seconds to surrender Ash and Luna voluntarily, or his team would take them by force, and any resistance would be met with lethal consequences that would be explained away as a tragic accident involving a mentally unstable former federal employee. The weight of the moment pressed down on Emily like a physical force, the knowledge that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but the future of two innocent creatures who trusted her completely. She thought about her grandmother's teachings, about the difference between existing and living, about the moments that define a person's character when everything else is stripped away. Harrison's team has Emily surrounded, but they've underestimated what a ranger will do to protect her own. Subscribe to see how far she'll go when cornered. Emily's response came not in words but in action, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years surviving in hostile territory where hesitation meant death. She triggered the stable's emergency lighting system, flooding the area with blinding white light that turned Harrison's tactical advantage into a liability, forcing his men to adjust their vision while she moved through familiar territory in controlled darkness. The stable became her fortress, every beam and post a potential cover, every shadow a place to disappear while her enemies stumbled through unfamiliar terrain. Emily had spent weeks learning every inch of the building, mapping escape routes and defensive positions, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between survival and slaughter. Her ranger training kicked in as she moved Luna and Ash toward the hidden passage she'd discovered behind the feed room, a tunnel that Dr. Thorne had excavated as an emergency escape route during his years of hiding from those who now hunted his legacy. The tunnel was narrow and dark, carved through Montana clay by desperate hands that had understood the value of having multiple exits when powerful enemies came calling. Emily led Luna through the passage while carrying Ash, the foal's weight nothing compared to the burden of responsibility she felt for their safety, her flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed to press against them like a living thing. Behind them, she could hear Harrison's men entering the stable, their shouts and radio chatter echoing through the wooden structure as they discovered the empty stalls and realized their prey had vanished. The tunnel stretched for nearly a quarter-mile, emerging in a grove of cottonwood trees where Dr. Thorne had hidden a cache of supplies and emergency equipment, including a modified horse trailer designed for rapid evacuation and a truck that had been maintained in running condition despite years of abandonment. Emily's hands shook as she loaded Luna and Ash into the trailer, knowing that once she started the engine, there would be no turning back, no possibility of negotiation or peaceful resolution. The chase began as Emily's truck roared to life, its engine echoing across the valley like a declaration of war against those who believed that money and power gave them the right to take whatever they desired. Harrison's vehicles responded immediately, their powerful engines and sophisticated tracking equipment turning the escape into a deadly game of cat and mouse across Montana's unforgiving landscape. Emily drove with the desperate skill of someone who understood that capture meant death, not just for herself, but for the innocent creatures who trusted her to keep them safe from those who would cage them or worse. The truck's radio crackled with Harrison's voice, alternating between threats and promises, trying to convince Emily that surrender was her only option, while his men closed the distance with military precision. But Emily had advantages that Harrison's urban warriors couldn't match: intimate knowledge of the terrain, years of experience navigating wilderness roads in all weather conditions, and the desperate strength that comes from fighting for something more important than personal survival. The pursuit led through mountain passes and hidden valleys, across terrain that tested both vehicles and drivers to their limits, where one wrong turn could mean plunging into ravines that would swallow trucks and passengers without a trace. Emily used every trick she'd learned during her years chasing poachers and smugglers, taking shortcuts through creek beds and abandoned mining roads that existed on no official maps, pushing her truck beyond its design limits while Harrison's heavier vehicles struggled with the rough terrain. Luna and Ash rode in terrified silence, the mare's eyes wide with fear, but trusting Emily's judgment even as the trailer swayed and bounced over rocks and ruts that threatened to tear the axles apart. Emily found herself praying as she drove, not for divine intervention, but for the strength to see this through, to prove worthy of the trust that two innocent creatures had placed in her hands when they had nowhere else to turn. The radio brought news that chilled Emily's blood. Harrison had called in air support, helicopters that could track her movement from above and coordinate ground units to cut off her escape routes. The game had escalated beyond a simple chase into a military operation, with resources that spoke of government backing and unlimited budgets, forces that could pursue her across state lines and international borders if necessary. Emily realized that she wasn't just running from Harrison's team, she was fleeing from a system that had decided her life was expendable in service of larger objectives, that would sacrifice her and her charges to protect secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her as she navigated increasingly treacherous roads, knowing that every mile brought her closer to a confrontation that would determine whether justice or power would prevail in the end. As night fell over the Montana wilderness, Emily made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Instead of continuing to run, she would make her stand in the place where this all began, returning to fight for the stable and the legacy that Dr. Thorne had died protecting. The truck's headlights cut through darkness as she turned back toward the valley, toward a confrontation with forces that had never expected their prey to turn and fight, that had underestimated what a ranger would do when cornered and desperate. Emily thought about her father's war stories, about soldiers who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, because retreat meant abandoning something more valuable than their own lives. The stable waited in the darkness ahead, no longer just a building, but a symbol of everything worth fighting for in a world where power too often triumphed over principle. Emily's decision to return and fight will surprise Harrison's forces, but the Ranger has one more card to play. Subscribe to see how a lifetime of protecting the innocent prepares someone for their final stand. The stable stood silhouetted against the Montana sky like a cathedral of broken dreams, its weathered walls bearing witness to decades of struggle between those who would preserve and those who would possess. Emily approached through the darkness with Luna and Ash, her heart pounding with the rhythm of someone who'd chosen principle over survival, who'd decided that some things were worth dying for, even when living seemed like the easier choice. The building that had started as a simple rescue operation had become the center of a war between competing visions of what America should be, a place where the powerful took what they wanted, or a land where the innocent could find sanctuary from those who would exploit them. Emily's hands were steady as she prepared for the confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of a bloodline that represented something irreplaceable in a world increasingly dominated by corporate interests and government overreach. Harrison's forces had regrouped during Emily's absence, establishing a perimeter around the stable with the professional efficiency of those who'd conducted similar operations in foreign countries, where American citizens had fewer rights and international law provided convenient cover for necessary actions. Emily counted at least 12 men now, reinforcements that spoke of the importance placed on recovering Ash and Luna, resources that confirmed her suspicions about the true scope of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. The silver-haired director stood in the center of his deployment like a general surveying a battlefield, his confidence absolute in the knowledge that overwhelming force would prevail over individual resistance, that Emily's return was simply the final act in a drama whose ending had been predetermined by those with superior firepower and unlimited budgets. But Emily had spent her career studying predators, learning their patterns and weaknesses, understanding that even the most dangerous hunters could be defeated by prey that refused to behave according to expected patterns. The confrontation began with Emily's voice cutting through the darkness, amplified by the stable's old public address system that Dr. Thorne had installed for emergency communications, her words carrying across the valley with the authority of someone who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve that transcended any government agency or corporate interest. She spoke about Luna and Ash, about their right to exist, free from those who would cage them for profit, about the difference between stewardship and ownership that separated those who truly loved animals from those who saw them as commodities to be traded. Emily's words were broadcast, not just to Harrison's forces, but to a wider audience, transmitted through emergency frequencies to every ranger station and wildlife office within 100 miles, creating witnesses to whatever was about to unfold in the Montana darkness. The stable's lights blazed like a beacon, transforming the building from a hiding place into a stage where the final act of Dr. Thorne's legacy would be performed before an audience that included both enemies and allies. Harrison's response was swift and brutal, his men advancing with military precision while he remained safely behind cover, directing the assault with the cold calculation of someone who'd ordered similar operations in places where body counts were classified, and accountability was a luxury that interfered with operational effectiveness. Emily met their advance with the desperate courage of someone who'd run out of options except surrender or death, her rifle speaking with the voice of every ranger who'd ever stood alone against overwhelming odds to protect something precious and irreplaceable. The stable became a fortress under siege, its wooden walls providing cover while Emily moved through familiar territory with the fluid grace of someone fighting on home ground, every shadow and corner offering opportunities to strike back against those who'd underestimated her determination. Luna and Ash huddled in the reinforced stall that Emily had prepared for this moment, protected by steel plates and concrete barriers that Dr. Thorne had installed during his years of hiding from the same forces that now sought to claim his legacy. The battle raged through the night, a deadly game of cat and mouse where Emily's intimate knowledge of the terrain balanced against Harrison's superior numbers and equipment, where individual skill and determination faced off against institutional power and unlimited resources. Emily fought with the precision of someone who'd spent years tracking dangerous predators, using every trick she'd learned during her career to stay one step ahead of enemies who'd expected easy victory over a lone woman with outdated equipment. The stable's emergency lighting cast strange shadows as Emily moved through the building, appearing and disappearing like a ghost defending sacred ground, her rifle finding targets with the accuracy that came from years of practice and the desperate strength that emerged when everything worth protecting hung in the balance. Harrison's men began to fall back, their confidence shaken by resistance they hadn't expected, by the realization that they were fighting someone who'd rather die than surrender what she'd sworn to protect. As dawn broke over the Montana Valley, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. Not Harrison's reinforcements, but federal agents responding to Emily's emergency broadcasts. Rangers and wildlife officers who'd heard her call and understood that one of their own was making a final stand against forces that threatened everything they'd sworn to protect. Harrison's face went pale as he realized that his covert operation had become a public spectacle, that the witnesses he'd tried to eliminate had multiplied beyond his ability to silence them all, that the conspiracy he'd worked to keep hidden was about to be exposed to scrutiny that would end careers and topple governments. Emily emerged from the stable with Luna and Ash, her uniform torn and bloodied, but her spirit unbroken, leading her charges into the morning light like a shepherd, bringing her flock home from the wilderness. The foal that had started as a simple rescue had become a symbol of resistance against those who believed that power gave them the right to take whatever they desired, that money could purchase anything, including the silence of those who'd witnessed their crimes. The dawn brings federal reinforcements, but Harrison has one final card to play. Subscribe to see how Emily's stand transforms from personal battle into a movement that will change everything. 5 years had passed since Emily first heard Ash's cry beneath the rotting floorboards, and the stable that once stood as a monument to abandonment now thrived as the Thorn Memorial Sanctuary. The morning sun cast long shadows across pastures where dozens of rescued horses grazed freely, their coats gleaming with health and purpose. Emily stood at the fence line, watching Ash, now a magnificent stallion, lead a small herd of mares and foals toward the creek that ran clear and cold through the heart of the property. His mother, Luna, had passed peacefully 2 winters ago, but not before seeing her son become the foundation sire of a new generation. The bloodline that Marcus Thorne had died protecting now flourished under Emily's careful stewardship, each foal born carrying the genetic legacy of horses that had once roamed these very mountains. The cry that had drawn Emily into the darkness had become a song of renewal that echoed across the valley. The legal battles had been fierce and costly, but Emily's documentation of the horse's heritage and the support of wildlife conservation groups had ultimately prevailed. The syndicate's attempts to claim the animals had crumbled when federal investigators uncovered evidence of their illegal breeding operations and connections to black market wildlife trafficking. Marcus Thorne's hidden records had provided the key evidence needed to shut down a network that had been operating for decades, stealing and exploiting rare bloodlines for profit. Emily had testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for heritage breeds, her voice steady as she described finding Ash trapped beneath the ruins of greed and neglect. The Thorne Protection Act had passed unanimously, establishing federal oversight for genetic preservation programs and creating funding for sanctuaries like the one Emily now operated. The stable that had once hidden secrets now stood as a beacon of transparency and hope. Visitors came from around the world to see the horses and learn about conservation efforts, but Emily was careful to maintain the sanctuary's primary mission. Each morning began with the same ritual: walking the fence lines, checking on the herds, and spending quiet moments with Ash in the paddock where she'd first nursed him back to health. The stallion had never forgotten those early days, and he would still nicker softly when Emily approached, lowering his great head to rest against her shoulder. She could feel the strength in his muscles, the power that flowed through bloodlines stretching back centuries to horses that had carried warriors and explorers across untamed lands. The responsibility of preserving that legacy weighed heavily on her shoulders, but it was a burden she carried with pride and determination. Every foal born at the sanctuary represented another victory against extinction, another thread in the tapestry of genetic diversity that humans had spent generations unraveling. The old stable had been carefully restored and now served as a museum and education center, its walls lined with photographs and documents telling the story of Marcus Thorne's secret mission. Emily had insisted on preserving the hidden compartment where she'd found the veterinary records, turning it into a memorial to the man who had sacrificed everything to save what others would have destroyed. School groups toured the facility regularly, children pressing their faces against the glass cases that held breeding charts and genetic analyses, their eyes wide with wonder at the complexity of bloodline preservation. Emily often spoke to these groups about the importance of protecting endangered species, but she always ended with the same message. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and we must always listen for the cries of those who cannot speak for themselves. The stable that had once echoed with Ash's desperate whimpers now rang with the laughter of children learning to care for the natural world. The breeding program had exceeded all expectations, with genetic testing confirming that the sanctuary's horses carried markers from bloodlines thought lost forever. Universities sent researchers to study the animals, and Emily had established partnerships with conservation programs across North America and Europe. The foals born at Thorn Memorial were in high demand, but Emily was selective about placement, ensuring that each animal went to facilities committed to preservation rather than profit. She had learned from Marcus Thorn's mistakes, maintaining detailed records and working openly with government agencies to ensure transparency in all operations. The network of sanctuaries and breeding facilities that had grown from Emily's initial rescue now spanned 3 continents, all connected by the genetic legacy that had survived in a collapsing stable in Montana. The cry that had changed Emily's life had become a call to action that resonated around the world. Luna's grave sat beneath an ancient oak tree at the highest point of the property, marked by a simple stone that bore her name and the dates of her too short life. Emily visited the site every evening, often accompanied by Ash, who seemed to understand the significance of the place where his mother rested. The mare had lived just long enough to see her son grow strong and to witness the first foals born at the sanctuary, her eyes bright with contentment as she watched the bloodline she had helped preserve take root in safe soil. Emily had been with her at the end, holding the old mare's head as her breathing grew shallow and finally stilled, whispering promises that her sacrifice would never be forgotten. The veterinarian who performed the necropsy had found evidence of old injuries consistent with the abuse Luna had suffered before finding refuge in the stable, but also signs of healing that spoke to the peace she had found in her final years. Her legacy lived on not just in Ash, but in every horse that now ran free across the sanctuary's pastures. The financial success of the sanctuary had allowed Emily to expand beyond horse rescue, and the facility now housed a variety of endangered species native to the region. Wolves, elk, and even a small population of bison roamed designated areas of the property, all part of a comprehensive ecosystem restoration project that had garnered international attention. Emily had hired a team of dedicated staff members, many of them veterans, who found purpose and healing in caring for animals that had also survived trauma and abandonment. The stable that had once stood empty and forgotten now bustled with activity around the clock, as caretakers monitored pregnant mares, researchers collected genetic samples, and educators prepared presentations for visiting groups. The transformation was so complete that Emily sometimes had to remind herself of the desolation she had first encountered, the silence broken only by a foal's desperate cry for help. The sanctuary had become a living testament to the power of compassion and the possibility of redemption. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, with reporters and documentary filmmakers eager to tell the story of the ranger who had saved a bloodline from extinction. Emily had been reluctant to embrace the spotlight, preferring to let the horses speak for themselves, but she had gradually come to understand the importance of sharing their story with the world. The documentary that aired on National Geographic had brought millions of dollars in donations and had inspired similar rescue efforts across the country. Emily had used her platform to advocate for stronger animal protection laws and increased funding for conservation programs, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had literally pulled hope from the ruins of despair. The stable that had hidden Marcus Thorne's secrets now stood as a symbol of transparency and accountability in conservation work. The cry that had drawn Emily into the darkness had become a rallying call for all who believed in the possibility of saving what seemed lost forever. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Emily made her way to the paddock where Ash stood silhouetted against the setting sun. The stallion turned at her approach, his eyes reflecting the same intelligence and spirit that had sustained him through those first desperate hours beneath the collapsed floor. Emily reached out to touch his neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse beneath her palm, the life force that connected him to generations of horses that had run wild across these mountains. The sanctuary would continue to grow and evolve, new challenges would arise, and new rescues would test her resolve. But the foundation had been laid in that moment when she had chosen to listen to a cry for help rather than walk away. The bloodline that Marcus Thorne had died protecting now thrived under open skies, and the stable that had once hidden secrets now stood as a beacon of hope for all who believed in the power of second chances. The cry that had changed everything still echoed in Emily's memory, a reminder that salvation often comes to those who are willing to dig through the ruins of the past to uncover the promise of the future. In the distance, a new foal called to its mother, the sound carrying across the pastures like a prayer answered. Emily smiled, knowing that somewhere in that cry was the echo of Ash's first desperate plea for life, the sound that had led her to this moment and this purpose. The sanctuary would endure, the bloodlines would flourish, and the legacy of a collapsing stable purchased for $1 would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and preserving hope for generations yet to come. The stable that had once stood as a monument to abandonment now served as a testament to the transformative power of love, and the cry that had broken Emily's heart had ultimately healed it, filling the silence with the sound of life renewed and hope restored. The circle was complete, but the story would continue, written in the hoofbeats of horses running free across land that would forever remember the day a ranger heard a cry for help and chose to answer.